Welcome, my name is Sam Allberry.
And I'm TJ Tims.
And this is Persuasive Preaching, a mini-series looking at how our words about Jesus can connect with where people are really at.
That's right, because it's so easy to skip across the surface of the culture as someone who talks about Jesus or as a preacher without ever really connecting with people's questions or their pain points. So we want to talk about how we can both preach the Bible and at the same time preach the Bible into the deep questions in the culture.
Because we believe knowing Jesus is the greatest experience in life.
That's right.
And we want to do all that we can to introduce people to Jesus and to help those of us who are already Christians continue in our walk with him to get to know him better.
Yeah, and this is something that we do. I'm a preacher, lead pastor of Emmanuel Church in Nashville, Tennessee. And like many cities in America, there are a whole lot of people from a whole lot of places moving in, so that every Sunday or Wednesday when I get up to preach, there are all kinds of questions in the room that are not the questions I grew up with. And there's all kinds of things there that I can't see. Yeah. So we are sort of learning as we go, and we have learned some things that we can share that might help.
Yeah, and for me, I'm involved in the same church. I have a very naturally skeptical mind. Whenever I hear a politician kind of outlining their kind of policies, or even sometimes when I'm hearing a sermon, sometimes even my own, my question is, why? You need to persuade me.
Yeah.
I'm not naturally on board. I don't buy it just because you're pushing it at me.
Yeah, that's right.
And so as a Christian, I'm naturally drawn to the questions people have, the objections, the sticking points, the so whats. And so in my own experience of Christian ministry, I've gravitated into that sort of area of trying to find answers to the big questions people have.
Yeah. Sam, one way we talked about framing what it is we're doing here is with the polarities, these two ditches that we can fall into today. Can you describe those?
Yeah, I think particularly for those who do a lot of this kind of stuff or who want to, one danger is we can be people who are convinced about the Bible, and maybe we're even a Bible teacher or a preacher in some way, but what we're saying is just not connecting with where people are at. We're speaking true words from the Bible out into the ether, but they're not really landing with people.
Yeah,
there's a disconnect there. And I think the other ditch I've noticed is there can be people who are really interested in all the kind of big hot button cultural issues, but the Bible's kind of shoved to one side because they don't realize the Bible is how we answer these questions.
That's right.
So I'd love those who are already committed to teaching the Bible to realize actually that teaching needs to be connected to where the culture is at. And those who are really keen to be relevant to realize actually the Bible is the key to being relevant.
Yeah, and what you're saying, Sam, about these two ditches is even more important for us all to understand today. Because, one of the things that we're going to talk about is how it doesn't matter if you're where I'm from in rural Alabama or if you're in London, England. The smartphone means that we're all basically influenced by the same big cultural forces today. Yeah. So this is relevant to everybody no matter where you are right now.
Yeah. So what we're going to do over the next couple of episodes is think about why we need to engage with this culture. Think about why actually we need to be people who do share the message of Jesus, the place of actually we have something to even preach.
Yeah.
And then the way we use the Bible in that process. And this is actually what the Bible is for. So that's where we're going to be going. But in this first session, we're going to think about why we do need to do that work of trying to connect to the culture and kind of commend the faith into the particular cultural moment we find ourselves in.
Yeah. And Sam, you've been doing this for a while now. Where does your mind go when you want to sort of build out the category of what we call apologetics, which can sound like a word with a real barrier to entry here. I'm not sure I want to be associated with this word apologetics. What is this?
It's a weird word. Let's just be honest about that.
Yeah. So how would you explain it?
Yeah, there's lots of places I could go, but the one that comes to mind in Acts 22, Paul is out there. He's commending the Christian faith. He's talking to a whole bunch of people who don't share his beliefs, and he says in Acts 22, verse 1, he speaks to the people who are standing there before him, and he says, "Hear the defense that I now make before you." Now that word defense, it means Paul is trying to, justify his beliefs.
Yeah, there's real opposition.
To a very skeptical crowd of people.
Yeah.
The word defense in the original Greek here is apologia. It's where we get the word apology from. Because in its original sense, the word apology didn't mean saying sorry. It meant giving an account. It meant making a defense of what you'd just done.
Yeah.
So this whole area we call apologetics is really looking at what Paul is doing here. It's giving a reason, an account for why we believe what we believe, even in the face of people who might think that's an absurd thing to believe.
Yeah, and one of the things I hear you saying there, Sam, is that this isn't for just like philosophers. This isn't for, people who just have a background in science. When we talk about apologetics, we're not only talking about these sort of big questions about why does God exist, but Paul there was giving a reason for his hope in the gospel to all kinds of people.
Yeah.
So, like the barrier to entry is like for all of us.
It is for all of us, and we're doing it to anyone. I mean, this is when your child asks some question about what you believe, in one sense you're doing apologetics.
Yeah.
When you feel questions coming up within your own heart about how you try and fit different aspects of your faith together, or how you account for bad things that happen in the world around you, we're doing apologetics.
Yeah, and it doesn't really matter where you are in the world. You are going to engage. If you're a Christian and you want to tell other people about Jesus, whether you're a preacher or whether you want to be a Christian who shares your faith, you're going to do some kind of apologetics, right? You're going to give some kind of reason for the hope that you have.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've noticed living in Nashville, Tennessee, having also lived in London, England, is that I get a lot of the same kinds of questions in Nashville that people are talking about in London.
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins, the atheist who's written a lot of books that are popular, he comes to Nashville, Tennessee to speak.
Yeah, and there's a big audience for him.
That's right. And, Peter Berger, the sociologist from Chicago, he had this category, the urbanization of consciousness. He came up with this category like in the 1980s, I think.
Yeah.
And basically what he was saying is what's happening in the urban centers of cultural influence is it goes everywhere, and it has influence everywhere. And that was true before social media. So how much more is it true now? I mean, what we can't say is, well, I'm in wherever. So the questions people are asking here, they're not that complex. Nobody's talking about sexuality. Everybody's talking about these things because they're everywhere.
Yeah, the questions we're thinking about, they don't have a zip code.
That's right.
They're everywhere. Where there's a smartphone, you have those very issues. So there's no geographical kind of locus of skepticism or unbelief. We feel it. We have it even in our own hearts.
So what would you say then, Sam, to the person? I know people who say this, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to misrepresent the kind of person who would say, that's all well and good, but I'm just going to preach the gospel.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I love the heart in that question because what it assumes is that there's power in the gospel, and we are not arguing with that.
No.
But how do you speak to the person who says, I don't really need to sort of, be that in touch with the culture because I'm just going to preach the gospel?
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic to that too. But I think what we want to say is this is how you preach the gospel. When you say, I just want to preach the gospel, you're assuming you understand your neighbor.
Ah, good point.
You're assuming you understand the person you're speaking to. And, if we're called to love our neighbor, part of that is understanding our neighbor.
Oh, that's a great point.
There are so many biblical verses encouraging us to listen really carefully to the people around us. So Proverbs 18:13 says that if someone speaks before they hear, it's folly and shame. You might be saying things that are true, but actually you need to have understood the person you're speaking to know whether you are choosing the right true words in the right kind of order to say to them. Similarly, Proverbs 20 verse 5 says that the purpose of a man's heart is like deep water.
Yeah.
In other words, what we see on the surface with someone is often just one small part and is not even the whole story.
Yeah.
There's often a whole bunch of stuff going on underneath that isn't immediately apparent, but time with that person will begin to reveal.
It's interesting, Sam. I think you're exactly right. And you started us off in Acts 22, where Paul gives the defense. But you see what you're describing, this listening and observing how to approach with the gospel. You see it in the Apostle Peter, because on the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit comes down in power, and immediately they all go out and start preaching. Peter begins, the first Christian sermon in the New Testament, he begins by quoting from the prophet Joel, which, today, if I asked most Christians, quote to me from the prophet Joel, they probably wouldn't be able to do it, and I'm not sure I can either.
It takes a while to find the prophet Joel in the Old Testament.
Yeah, but Peter knew who he was speaking to. He was speaking to Jews who knew the prophet Joel, so he could reason from there. But the interesting thing about that is that Peter also preaches the first sermon to the Gentiles in Acts chapter 10 with the Roman centurion Cornelius, who Peter knows does not have a background in the Bible, so Peter doesn't begin with Joel.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that he begins by referring to all that they've heard, the sort of gossip about Jesus that they've heard throughout Judea. So he begins where they are. He's listening, in other words. He's listening to Cornelius, and he doesn't change where the gospel lands. He doesn't change his preaching of the gospel. He changes the starting place in the gospel. So they're actually, what you're describing, the apostles are doing that in the New Testament already.
Well, that same Peter went on to write a couple of letters, and in one of them we have this verse which really does, I think, sum up everything we're trying to cover in this session. In 1 Peter 3, verse 15, Peter speaks about always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you, and to do it with gentleness and respect. And there's lots of great things we can pull out of that as we kind of draw this to a close. The first thing is that this is for all of us. Peter's not speaking to a subgroup. This is not a specialism.
That's right.
All of us have this responsibility of giving a defense, of accounting for what we believe to people around us.
Yeah, you know what I love about that too, Sam, is how he's not just talking about our reasons for hope, but he describes the way that we're supposed to engage, which I think right now, I mean, you and I we've talked a lot about how the tone of our engagement is more pronounced in this day and age than maybe it was 20 years ago. In other words, when people come into a conversation with a Christian, oftentimes now what they're expecting is some kind of a browbeating.
Yes.
And so the gentleness of our interaction is speaking, if I can put it this way, louder than it spoke in years past.
Yeah.
I remember hearing a story of Rich Mullins, the contemporary Christian writer and singer, who loved G.K. Chesterton, the 20th century apologist. And he liked to talk about, those big arguments. And he talks about arguing a person into a corner so that he basically won. He won the argument. There was nothing they could say. It was clear he won. And then he said something like, so do you want to become a Christian? And the man said, well, not if a Christian is like you. Wow. So he actually won the argument and he lost the person.
Wow.
Because it wasn't gentle and with respect.
Yeah, and those words are so significant, aren't they? Because gentleness and respect is not just saying, hey, be nice, be pleasant. Gentleness and respect are the very things that describe how Jesus has been to us.
That's exactly right.
I think another thing we can take from this that's particularly reassuring in this particular time is Peter's saying this in a context that is not friendly towards the Christian faith.
Oh, that's a good point.
This is the beginnings of what would become a very violent persecution in the Roman Empire against Christians.
Wow.
And Peter's saying, be gentle and respectful. And we can feel assured that we're not the first generation to find ourselves in a culture that is increasingly hostile to what we believe.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that there's a lot of ways in which the 21st century is more like the first century than it was the 20th century?
Yes.
I mean, especially when it comes to, sort of sexuality and even just the kind of hostility that you see, which is just commonplace in politics, for instance. I feel as if sometimes I'm reading the New Testament and I'm more in touch with, the world of the New Testament because of my experience in the 21st century. Yeah. And I now have the advantage of, having some memory from the 90s,
Yes.
So I can tell that something has changed, but it hasn't moved away from the Bible. It's actually moved nearer to the sort of, presuppositions of that the apostles were dealing with.
Yeah, which actually, it may not be easy for us as we go into this kind of season of culture, but, the gospel did great in that context the first time round. So we have reasons to be optimistic.
That's exactly right.
Things may get harder for us. I suspect they probably will.
Yeah.
but I have no reason to think the gospel will be anything other than very, very fruitful.
Yeah. So I can actually relax, and I can be gentle and respectful, and trust the gospel.
Yeah.
To do the heavy lifting.
Yeah. We don't need to panic. We don't need to freak out.
Yeah.
This is what the Bible's for, a time such as this.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Sam.
Well, that wraps up this first episode. We've begun to see why we need to engage with some of these cultural issues, that the Bible itself has a category of defending the faith, of apologetics. And in the next episode, we're going to be looking at why we therefore have reasons to share the message of Jesus, even to preach, of all things, in this day and age. So we hope you'll join us for that. Thank you.